The Palestinian president will have to address the UN General Assembly next week by video, as the U.S. has refused to give him a visa to travel to New York. Gaza, Israel's military getting closer to capturing Gaza City with tanks and ground forces moving in from the outskirts. Here's CNN's Jeremy Diamond.
Well, the Israeli military is slowly but decisively moving forward with its planned invasion of Gaza City, as Israeli tanks and troops have been spotted getting closer to the center of Gaza City, although for the moment harming them in cooperation with Israeli intelligence. But this latest very dire warning from Hamas really goes directly to so many of the fears that we have heard from the families of those Israeli hostages, which they have been voicing very loudly over the course of the last few weeks in almost daily protests in front of the Prime Minister's residence, for example, calling for a halt to this Gaza City offensive, an end to the war, fearing that their loved ones could be killed if Israeli forces continue to advance.
When Britain, Canada, and Australia all woke up on the same Sunday morning and collectively decided to recognize the state of Palestine, it wasn't just another diplomatic press release. It was a full-on geopolitical mic drop. Imagine three of your closest friends, the ones who have always backed you up in fights, suddenly announcing they're throwing their support to the person you've been fighting with for decades. That's basically how Israel felt when its long-standing allies suddenly flipped the script. Now, let's put this in perspective. For decades, these three nations have been firmly planted in Israel's corner. Britain has historical baggage all over the region, Canada has consistently voted pro-Israel at the UN, and Australia has been a steady supporter, often echoing Washington's talking points. Yet suddenly all three coordinated their moves like they were unveiling the latest iPhone. Sleek, dramatic, and guaranteed to dominate headlines. The symbolism is brutal. These aren't fringe players like San Marino or Luxembourg quietly raising their hands in the back row. This is a chunk of the G7 flexing at center stage. And that matters, because when major Western democracies pivot, it shifts the Overton window of what's considered mainstream policy. If the world stage is a dinner table, these three just stood up, clinked their glasses, and announced, "We're sitting with Palestine tonight." Of course, this wasn't purely altruistic. Domestic politics are at play here too. Britain's Labour government under Keir Starmer promised recognition months ago. Canada's leadership has been under pressure to take a moral stand. And Australia, always balancing its Western alliances with its Asia-Pacific identity, needed to signal independence. Together, the trio created a coordinated shockwave that can't just be brushed off as random. But if you think this diplomatic earthquake stopped there, think again, because Fact 2 shows us how the dominoes started falling faster than anyone expected. So Britain, Canada, and Australia drop their bombshell, and just when Israel thought it could catch its breath, Portugal casually strolls into the room like, "Hey guys, mind if I join the revolution?" If the big three were the headliners at this diplomatic concert, Portugal was the surprise guest artist who came on stage and made the crowd scream louder. Portugal's announcement wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. In Europe, Portugal isn't exactly the loudest voice in the room, but it's like that one friend in your group chat who says, "I'm in," and suddenly everyone else feels pressured to commit. What makes it powerful is the timing. They didn't wait weeks. They jumped on the recognition train the very same day. That creates momentum, the kind that turns a headline into a movement. And let's be honest, Portugal isn't acting alone. France had already been hinting that it was cooking up its own recognition announcement. Emmanuel Macron basically told the world in July, "I'll do it, but I'd like some company on stage." Well, now he's got company, and the company brought snacks. France is expected to make its move at the United Nations General Assembly, and once Paris speaks, other European nations like Belgium, Luxembourg, and even microstates like San Marino are likely to follow. This is how isolation works, slowly at first, then all at once. For Israel, watching countries recognize Palestine feels like being ghosted by your social circle one by one, except now the cool kids in Europe are leading the charge. And for Palestine, it signals a snowball effect, with recognition spreading from small nations to heavyweight players. The kicker: every time another Western democracy joins, it chips away at the narrative that recognizing Palestine is radical. Suddenly, it looks normal, expected, even overdue. But if you think these recognitions were bold, wait until you hear the volcanic fury erupting from Netanyahu in Fact 3. It's less diplomacy, more verbal fireworks.
If Britain, Canada, Australia, and Portugal thought they could drop this news quietly, they clearly underestimated Benjamin Netanyahu's flair for dramatic comebacks. Within hours of the announcements, Netanyahu delivered what can only be described as a political roast session, except no one was laughing. His exact words: recognizing Palestine is handing a massive prize to terror. Translation: he sees this move not as diplomacy, but as a straight-up betrayal. This wasn't just your average stern press release either. Netanyahu's tone was volcanic. He vowed there would never be a Palestinian state. Period. No loopholes, no exceptions, no asterisk in fine print. It was his version of slamming the table and saying, "Over my dead body." And then, with the confidence of a man who never ever leaves a cliffhanger unteased, he promised Israel would deliver a response after he returned from the US. You could almost hear the ominous "to be continued" soundtrack playing in the background. But here's the thing: Netanyahu wasn't just speaking to the international community. He was rallying his domestic base. By framing recognition as rewarding terrorism, he tapped into Israel's deep wounds from the October 7th attacks, a trauma that still defines the political conversation there. It's a classic Netanyahu strategy: take outside criticism, spin it as an existential threat, and double down on defiance. And in case anyone doubted his seriousness, he threw in another bombshell. Israel has doubled its settlements in the West Bank and will keep expanding. Think about that. The world is saying 2 states, and Netanyahu is saying, nah, how about twice the settlements instead? It's the ultimate middle finger to international pressure. But Netanyahu wasn't the only one bringing fire and brimstone, because in Fact 5, Israel's president jumped into the ring with his own scathing critique, and he aimed straight at the heart of the peace process. Just when you thought Netanyahu had hogged all the fiery sound bites, along comes Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, ready to pour more gasoline on the fire. Herzog's response to the wave of recognitions was less explosive than Netanyahu's, but arguably just as cutting. His main point: recognizing Palestine wouldn't help one Palestinian, free one hostage, or bring peace any closer. Ouch. Now, Herzog's style is different. He doesn't do the bombastic Vegas Shoyun routine like Netanyahu. Instead, he's more like the stern teacher shaking his head at a class that just doesn't get it. His tone was sober, almost mournful, as he labeled the day a sad one for those who seek true peace. It was the kind of line that makes international diplomats sigh while scribbling notes like, "Still no compromise here." But here's where it gets interesting. Herzog is supposed to be the more moderate, unifying figure in Israeli politics. His role as president is largely ceremonial, yet his voice carries moral weight. When even Herzog is this dismissive, it shows how across the board the Israeli establishment is rejecting these recognitions. From far-right ministers calling for annexation to centrist voices like Herzog warning against false hoops, the message is united. Israel isn't budging. And in case anyone doubted his seriousness, he threw in another bombshell. Israel has doubled its settlements in the West Bank and will keep expanding. Think about that. The world is saying 2 states, and Netanyahu is saying, nah, how about twice the settlements instead? It's the ultimate middle finger to international pressure. But Netanyahu wasn't the only one bringing fire and brimstone, because in Fact 5, Israel's president jumped into the ring with his own scathing critique, and he aimed straight at the heart of the peace process.
Here's the thing. While Britain, Canada, Australia, and Portugal might have grabbed the headlines, they're actually joining a club that's been open since the 80s. More than 140 United Nations member states already recognize Palestine as a state. That's not a handful, it's the overwhelming majority of the world. Think of it like a massive global WhatsApp group chat where nearly everyone already ticked the seen double blue check, but the West was still lurking silently. Now, The lurkers are finally typing. This number matters because recognition isn't some fringe idea pushed by outliers. It's the mainstream position across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. Countries like China and Russia recognized Palestine way back in 1988. Most of the global south has been on board for decades. So when the big three Western democracies make their move, it doesn't just add 3 new votes, it cracks open the narrative that serious nations only back Israel. For Palestinians, this is validation on a grand scale. Imagine being told for decades that your dream of statehood is unrealistic, only to look around and realize 2/3 of the world already believes in it. That's more than just symbolic. It's psychological fuel for a population exhausted by war, displacement, and occupation. But for Israel, the 140-plus tally isn't just a statistic. It's a nightmare that keeps getting worse. Every new Western democracy that joins makes it harder to claim Palestine's recognition is fringe or illegitimate. Instead, it paints Israel as increasingly isolated, backed mainly by Washington and a shrinking list of allies. So yeah, when Britain and friends stepped in, they weren't inventing a new idea. They were catching up to where most of the world has already been standing for decades. But if you think Israel's isolation sounds bad on paper, wait till you hear about America's role in all this, because Fact 6 reveals how the US is now the last giant holding the fort for Israel. If Israel is feeling lonely at the international lunch table, the only kid still sitting with them is the United States. And let's be honest, it's less best friends forever and more protective parent who refuses to admit their child started the fight. With Britain, Canada, and Australia crossing the floor to recognize Palestine, Washington suddenly looks like the lone defender at a trial where everyone else already voted guilty. Here's the math. To become a full UN member, Palestine needs 9 out of 15 Security Council votes and no veto from the Big Five: Britain, France, China, Russia, US. Britain's recognition takes away one potential veto. France is leaning pro-Palestine, and China and Russia have been on board since the 80s. So that leaves one country standing between Palestine and a blue and white UN flag: America. Now, America is no stranger to vetoing Palestinian sovereignty. It's practically a tradition. Washington has consistently blocked resolutions that even hint at recognizing Palestinian sovereignty, framing it as a negotiated outcome-only issue. But here's the plot twist. With its closest allies flipping sides, America's position looks increasingly like stubbornness rather than strategy. It's like the last person at a party insisting the music's too loud while everyone else is dancing. Domestically, the U.S. administration is in a bind. Support for Israel is still strong in Congress and among certain lobbies, but public opinion, especially among younger Americans, has shifted sharply towards sympathy for Palestinians. If Washington keeps wielding that veto, it risks not just global isolation, but also a growing disconnect with its own voters. So yeah, Israel still has the biggest kid on the block backing them, but that kid is starting to look more and more like the last one standing at an unpopular table. And while America clutches the veto pen like a lifeline, Fact 7 shows how the rest of the world is planning a massive recognition flash mob at the UN General Assembly.
If international diplomacy were a music festival, the United Nations General Assembly would be the main stage. And Palestine is about to get a full-blown recognition remix. With Britain, Canada, Australia, and Portugal setting the tempo, more countries are gearing up to drop their beats in unison. France is leading the hype, Belgium and Luxembourg are warming up backstage, and even tiny San Marino is like, "Don't forget about me, guys." It's less a trickle and more a wave, building into a moment that Israel can't simply brush aside. Why does the UNGA matter so much? Unlike the Security Council, there's no veto power here. Every country gets one vote, which means the US can't just wave a magic wand and shut things down. It's the world's ultimate group poll, and Palestine's recognition is becoming the most popular answer on the test. Over 140 countries have already voted yes in previous sessions, but now we're seeing Western heavyweights join the tally. That makes the optics impossible to ignore. For Israel, this is a nightmare scenario. Each new recognition isn't just a diplomatic handshake, it's another crack in the facade of international consensus that Israel has relied on for decades. At the UNGA, optics are the currency, and the optics now? A growing global coalition applauding Palestine's existence while Israel digs in its heels. And here's the kicker. French President Emmanuel Macron basically choreographed this entire flash mob. Back in July, he called on countries to join France in recognition at the UNGA. Fast forward to September, and suddenly the maybe later crowd is showing up with matching shirts and banners. So yes, the stage is set, the spotlight is hot, and Israel finds itself increasingly cast as the villain in a show it used to headline. But while the world's clapping for Palestine at the UNGA, Fact 8 reveals Israel's answer. And spoiler alert, it involves doubling down, literally, on settlements in the West Bank. If you thought global recognition might pressure Israel into softening their stance, think again. Netanyahu didn't just reject the idea of a Palestinian state, he bragged that Israel has doubled Jewish settlements in the West Bank and plans to keep going. Yes, doubled. That's like someone being told their diet isn't working and responding by ordering 2 extra-large pizzas. Settlements are one of the thorniest issues in the conflict. They're communities built on occupied land that Palestinians see as part of their future state. International law says they're illegal, but Israel treats them like expansion packs in a video game. New houses, new roads, new facts on the ground. The bigger they get, the harder it becomes to draw clean borders for a two-state solution. And Netanyahu knows this. Expanding settlements isn't just policy, it's strategy. It locks in realities that no peace deal can easily undo. For Palestinians, this is salt in the wound. Recognition by foreign governments is nice, but if more land is being carved up daily, then on-the-ground reality is moving in the opposite direction of diplomacy. Imagine being congratulated for your new house while watching a bulldozer tear up your backyard. That's what recognition feels like without halting settlements. Internationally, doubling down on settlements is Israel's way of saying, thanks for your opinion, but we'll keep doing what we want. It's defiance packaged as policy. And in domestic Israeli politics, this stance plays well with Netanyahu's right-wing base, who view settlements as not just legitimate, but essential. So while half the world is drawing up maps for a two-state solution, Israel is busy redrawing the actual terrain, one cement block at a time. But even in the face of bulldozers and concrete, Palestinians saw a glimmer of hope, because Fact 9 shows how Mahmoud Abbas framed recognition as more than just symbolism, calling it a genuine step toward peace.
While Netanyahu and Herzog were busy handing out doomsday quotes, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas was basically popping champagne, at least rhetorically. For him, the recognition by Britain, Canada, Australia, and Portugal wasn't just another headline. It was validation. Abbas called it an important and necessary step toward achieving a just and lasting peace. Translation, finally, some heavyweight nations are saying what Palestinians have been saying for decades. We exist, and we deserve a seat at the table. Abbas framed it as paving the way for a two-state solution, where Palestine and Israel could live side by side in security, peace, and good neighborliness. That last phrase might sound quaint, but it's actually political gold. He's appealing not just to international audiences, but also to moderate Israelis who still cling to the idea of coexistence. For Palestinians, it signals that diplomacy isn't completely dead, even if the ground reality screams otherwise. Of course, Abbas isn't blind. He knows recognition alone doesn't stop bombs from falling in Gaza or settlements from spreading in the West Bank. But politically, this move shifts momentum. It strengthens the Palestinian Authority's legitimacy, especially against Hamas, which often accuses Abbas of being weak and irrelevant. Now Abbas can say, look, the world recognizes us, not them. That's a powerful card in internal Palestinian politics. For ordinary Palestinians, this recognition is bittersweet. It's a morale boost, proof that their struggle is resonating globally, but also a reminder that international applause doesn't necessarily translate into immediate change on the ground. Still, when you've been waiting decades for validation, every step counts. So, while Israel dismissed recognition as meaningless, Abbas turned it into a rallying cry. This is the road to peace, if Israel's willing to walk it. But here's the plot twist, because Fact 10 reminds us that recognition, as historic as it feels, doesn't magically translate into reality on the ground. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Recognition is historic, but it doesn't change the facts on the ground. Palestine may now have more stamps of approval than a well-traveled passport, But that doesn't stop the bombs in Gaza, the hostages in limbo, or the bulldozers carving up land in the West Bank. Recognition is a headline. Reality is still brutal. For Palestine, this moment is like finally being invited to a fancy dinner party. But when you show up, the host hasn't set a chair for you yet. Yes, the world is clapping. Yes, the flag is rising higher at the UN. But the path to actual statehood runs through a minefield, literally and politically. To become a full UN member, Palestine needs a Security Council vote. And we already know who's holding the veto pen: the United States. Washington might be the last domino standing, but it's a domino the size of a skyscraper. For Israel, the recognition wave is seen not as progress, but as betrayal, reinforcing the bunker mentality that's fueled decades of defiance. And in a way, Netanyahu's gamble is simple: keep building, keep resisting, and hope the world eventually moves on to the next crisis. Spoiler alert, the Middle East never runs out of crises. So, what we're left with is a paradox. On one hand, Palestine has never been closer to global legitimacy. 140-plus countries recognize it, and now even Western democracies are joining in. On the other hand, a functioning Palestinian state has never felt further away. Its hope colliding with hard reality, recognition clashing with resistance. So, here's the million-dollar question. Is this the dawn of a new chapter in Middle East peace, or just another symbolic victory that fades into the background? Drop your hottest take in the comments below. And if you want your news bold, witty, and dripping with global drama, smash that subscribe button to keep riding with that Global Pulse news. Because in geopolitics, the plot twists are relentless, and you don't want to blink.